presentation is an examination of some issues that have affected the Native American cultural values and traditions. They're highlighting the importance of recognizing problems that to some may appear simplistic and annoying, but to others feel discriminating and stereotyping one's culture. It will include some video clips, factual statements, court cases, case studies, and definitions in hopes to enlighten and encourage a broader view of Native American culture and allow one to view from a different perspective and raise awareness. The self-determination era is the current phase that Native Americans are in, set forth by the government. It means the federal government in the 1970s decided it was time there to be less governing by them and more participation by Indians. This is when the Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 became a significant law. It allowed for Indian tribes to control and distribute the services that were created by federal government. They introduced federal programs at first to help the Indians in areas that they were affected, which included the primary services that I'll discuss in the next slide. Education assistance from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In 1974, Bureau of Indian Affairs published a regulation pertaining to students' rights and due process procedures for schools operated by the Bureau. In the regulation, the clause, quote, "the right to freedom from discrimination," end quote, was included. Under 20 U.S.C. 3192, Section 602, establishment of a new Title VI of Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, it was cited Emergency School Aid Act, finds that the process of eliminating or preventing minority group isolation and improving the education of all children involves extra funds for educational agencies that do not have access to them. This is to help with the elimination of minority group segregation and discrimination among students in elementary and secondary schools. You might wonder, okay, that's a public law involving education, but how does it relate towards mascots and team names? Well, if you think about it, the federal government provides additional funding specifically for education revolving around minority groups. This includes Native Americans, to eliminate discrimination and segregation. So we pay more to educate children in elementary and secondary school in hopes to prevent this, but then turn around and use one's culture and traditions as a mascot and a signage for a sport or school? Doesn't make much sense to backtrack. Years now. These activities use political, legal, and civil tactics to force understanding of mistreatment towards Native Americans. A large protest eventually formed into an organization. This was called the National Coalition of Racism in Sports and Media and was established in 1992. They took initiative to show that there was a misconception of American Indians resulting in racial, cultural, and spiritual stereotyping due to sports identification. When we start speaking in legal terms of what negatively happens, the word defamation can come to play. Defamation is defined by Cornell Law School as a statement that injures a third party's reputation and includes both libel and slander. So libel means defamation expressed by print, pictures, signs, or any communication that's embodied by a physical form, and that's injurious to a person's reputation, exposes a person to public hatred, contempt, or ridicule, or injures a person in his or her business or profession. That is known is the New York Times Co. versus Sullivan. In 1964, a lawsuit was brought to court by an elected official that claimed he was libeled by advertisement in a newspaper, and that included some false statements that were published. This defamation case enlightened the term, quote, actual malice, quote, which means a publicly known figure must show that with knowledge that it was false or with reckless disregard of whether or not it was false or not. To understand what defamation means and the involvement legally with the acts of defamation. So next we will take a look at some headlines that have been made to bring attention to using mascots in Native American culture inappropriately in schools and sports. Now if we look at the map in blue, it will show the areas of the most population of Native Americans. Native Americans, as of 2020 census, there are 4.4 million estimated Americans with only Indigenous ancestry. That is only 1.3% of American population. Looking for the purple map, it shows the high school mascots that reference Native Americans. So this kind of gives you an insight of an overall view of the United States. There are a total of 42,624 teams that are referencing Native Americans. This chart is only referencing the high school teams, which is there's 2,129 teams that reference Native Americans. The NCAA Executive Committee adopted a new policy in an announcement made August 5th of 2005. The NCAA prohibited NCAA colleges, universities from displaying hostile and abusive racial, ethnic, national origin mascots, nicknames, or imagery at any of the 88 NCAA championships. Just before that, though, in 2004, 33 schools were to be submitted for evaluation to the NCAA to determine the extent of use of Native Americans imagery or references on their campus. Now, out of those schools, 18 colleges and universities still continue to use Native imagery, while 14 schools have removed all references to Native American culture. There is an exception for one school from that ban, and that is the Florida State Seminoles. That's because they got approval by both Seminole tribes. There's one in Florida and one in Oklahoma. For the professional sports teams, this includes the Kansas City Chiefs, the Cleveland Indians, whose mascot was known as Chief Wahoo, the Atlanta Braves, and one of the most talked about ones is been the Washington Redskins. Congress of American Indians has been advocating against mascots due to their harmful physiological and cultural impact on Native Americans. Recently, the advocating for a change during the Black Lives Matter protests have sparked a new light on professional sports teams in the NFL, the NHL, and the MLB to remove Native American imagery to correct the past harm that has been done. In Pro Football Incorporated versus Black Horse, this is an important case because it is refusal by the Patent and Trademark Office to cancel registration of trademarks by Pro Football that involves the use of Native American features. The argument by Black Horse was that the trademarks may disparage Native Americans and bring them to contempt under Section 2A of the Lanham Act. This next video and try to relate as much as you can to what it's trying to come across in the message.
Proud, forgotten, Indian, Navajo, Blackfoot, Inuit, and Sioux, survivor, spiritualist, patriot, Sitting Bull, Hiawatha, and Jim Thorpe, mother, father, son, daughter, chief, Apache, Pueblo, Choctaw, Chippewa, and Crow, underserved, struggling, resilient, Squanto, Red Cloud, Tecumseh, and Crazy Horse, rancher, teacher, doctor, soldier, Seminole, Seneca, Mohawk, and Creek, Mills, Will Rogers, Geronimo, unyielding, strong, indomitable. Native Americans call themselves many things. The one thing they don't.
The American Psychological Association. The use of American Indian mascots is troubling because schools are a place for learning. Mascots are teaching stereotypical, misleading history, and sometimes it can be insulting images of American Indians. The APA based its position on the growing body of social literature that shows racial stereotyping. This also can be a negative effect on more than just American Indian students. The inclusion of students that are from a community with little to no contact with Indigenous peoples may participate with inaccurate misconceptions about American Indian culture. In addition, it undermines American Indian nation to be able to portray an accurate and more respectful representation of their culture and traditions.
As my own people attack some of our traditional people for believing in our own Lakota way of life.
The media often portrays us as like these sad, like poverty-stricken people.
You know, there isn't that focus on who we are today.
We live on the poorest county in America. It's poverty-stricken, but just because we live in poverty don't mean we're poor.
Do you feel American?
Nah, I've always been taught we were Indian. We were Lakota first before we were anything else, before we were Christian, before we were American.
This presentation was to just bring together the negative effects of misrepresentation and the effect it has on others, and how it's important. Understanding the meaning to someone else's culture and tradition is a large part of doing away with discrimination. These next few clips are ways that shift to the more positive effects that sports and events have on tradition and culture when Native Americans are able to have representation. Thanks for watching this presentation and enjoy.
And tonight we're going to do an honoring not only for 22, but for our people, our heritage, and our ancestors.
That had played the game before us, and we play that game as a ritual, as a medicine to heal ourselves or heal our people, our community, and nation.
He played a lot of songs from Indigenous artists, which was beautiful, and songs that just got me pumped. I didn't even know he was Indigenous for the first half, and then Superman's performance was breathtaking. And got to dance on this floor, on this seat in this stadium was an important moment for me.
It's really important because like we never had a chance to do that before, and like we were always just left out.
Welcome to the Pendleton Roundup.